more than 1,000. The cause of this sudden efflorescence was the establishment of the first Zen monasteries in China. Up until the 7th century, the transmission of Zen was based on a private relationship between a teacher and a handful of students. Thus, it is not surprising that Zen remained such a hidden tradition. In such a setting, a text like the Lankavatara could be used to its advantage. But with the establishment of large-scale Zen communes, Zen masters looked for something better suited to larger audiences of varying degrees of comprehension. They found their text in the Diamond Sutra. This was the sutra the fifth patriarch transmitted to Huineng, the illiterate rice pounder, or so he has been presented, who became the sixth patriarch in 672. Ironically, this transmission took place with the Lankavatara forming the backdrop. It was only after Shensu and Huineng, the two contenders to become the fifth patriarch's successor, had written their competing poems on the monastery wall previously scheduled for scenes from the Lanka that the patriarchship and the future direction of Zen was decided. For readers interested, the story of this event, putative or not, is laid out in detail at the beginning of the Platform Sutra. Even though the Diamond Sutra replaced the Lankavatara in terms of making the teaching of Zen more accessible to larger audiences, the Lankavatara continued to attract those who appreciated the challenge and the rewards of the more difficult text. One such person was Shensu, the loser of the poetry contest that made Huineng the sixth patriarch. He was a great admirer of the Lanka. In fact, he asked to be buried beneath a small hillock he named Mount Lanka, and where his body has remained since his death in 706. And he wasn't the only one interested in the sutra. In 698, Empress Wu Tse-Tiin asked a monk from the Silk Road Kingdom of Khotan to produce a new translation of the Lanka, one that she could read. The Khotanese monk's name was Shikshananda, and at the empress' request he prepared a rough draft. But when he was done, he asked and was given permission to return home, and the task of revising his draft fell to Mituo Shan, a monk from the Silk Road Kingdom of Tokhara, who was assisted by the Chinese monks Fu Li and Fatsang. Their joint translation was completed in 704, and shortly thereafter Fatsang wrote a commentary on the sutra. Although it was only a summary, taking up but 8 pages in the Taisho Canon, volume 39, it includes some interesting information. For example, Fatsang said that he and his fellow translators had 5 Sanskrit copies from which to work. He also noted that in the Silk Road Kingdom of Khotan, where Shikshananda was from, the Lankavatara was said to exist in much larger versions, one consisting of 100,000 stanzas and another of 36,000, compared to the slightly more than 1,000 stanzas for the version he and his colleagues translated. Of course, similar statements were made about other sutras for which no such epic versions have ever been found. But even if this was just an account of someone's fantasy, it does suggest that someone thought highly enough of the Lanka, either in India or along the Silk Road, to have copies made and distributed, and that someone elevated it to membership in that pantheon of scriptures too stupendous for human eyes, but not for the human imagination. Another item of interest is an essay written in 708 by a monk named Qingcha Hua entitled Leng Che Shi Tzu Chi. Records of the Masters of the Lanka. In this essay, he lists the first Zen patriarchs beginning with Gunabhadra, followed by Bodhidharma, Huikyo, Seng Tiesan, Tao Hsin, Hung Zhen, and then Shensu and other students of Hung Zhen, instead of Huineng. This was the lineage of what became known as the Northern School of Zen that took exception to the selection of Huineng as the sixth patriarch, rather than Shensu. Although Qingcha Hua's account is somewhat biased, he was a disciple of Shensu. His essay is still noteworthy for honoring Gunabhadra as the man who established the teaching of Zen in China through his translation of the Lanka. This status is also reflected in the commentarial tradition. Despite the more accessible Chinese of Shikshananda's translation, whenever anyone wrote a commentary on the Lankavatara, he invariably based it on Gunabhadra's version. Unfortunately, except for 3 pages of comments attributed to Aryadeva, according to most scholars, erroneously, that critique Hinayana doctrines in the Lanka, an 8-page summary by Fatsang, and surviving portions of a longer commentary by another Khotanese contemporary of Fatsung, no early commentaries have come down to us, except as quoted material in later commentaries. It is not until nearly 600 years later that we get commentaries that have been passed down intact to the present day. Nowadays we have the good fortune to have more than 20 to choose from. But all are based on Gunabhadra's translation. As I have mentioned, the Lankavatara can appear forbidding, and Gunabhadra's translation certainly is not inviting. In a preface by Sutungpo written in 1085 for a new edition of Gunabhadra's translation, China's most famous poet of the day wrote, "The meaning of the Lankavatara is so subtle and elusive and its language so unadorned and antiquated that the reader is often unable to read it, much less get past the words to the meaning or past the meaning to its heart. What made it so difficult to read was that despite translating the text into Chinese, Gunabhadra was apparently concerned that he might misrepresent the meaning and often resorted to retaining the Sanskrit word order, rendering passages where he does this nearly incomprehensible. And yet, this is the version on which all commentaries are based, and it is the one I have chosen to translate. I am not sure how previous commentators have managed to understand as much of the text as they have. No doubt, they did what I did, which was to compare Gunabhadra's translation with those of Bodhiruchi and Shikshananda and, when possible, the Sanskrit. When Suzuki translated the Lankavatara into English 80 years ago, he decided to do just the opposite. He based himself on the recension of the Sanskrit text prepared by Bunyu Nangyo in 1923. As a recension, it was a composite based on half a dozen copies that went back no earlier than the 18th and 19th centuries and that contained hundreds of errors. It almost appears as if these copies were not meant to be read, as if they were copied for merit and based on other copies copied for merit. Suzuki was aware of the problematic nature of Nangyo's Sanskrit recension, but he felt that it brought him closer to the original. And whenever he couldn't make sense of the Sanskrit, he turned to the Chinese of Shikshananda for help and less frequently to that of Bodhiruchi, and hardly ever to that of Gunabhadra. Unfortunately, the Sanskrit text at our disposal has not improved. In 1963, the Indian scholar P. L. Vaidya produced a second recension, but it was only marginally different from Nangyo's, if only because it was based on the same flawed copies. More recently, the Japanese scholar Jishin Tokiwa has produced an entirely new Sanskrit text. But it is not a new recension, nor is it based on any newly discovered Sanskrit copies. Rather, it is the result of translating Gunabhadra's Chinese text back into Sanskrit. I should note that there are also two Tibetan translations. One is a translation made by Chas Grub around AD 840. But it, too, is a translation of Gunabhadra's Chinese text. The second is a translation of unknown date by an unknown translator based on what I am told is essentially the same Sanskrit text we have today. In considering which text to use for my own translation, I really had no choice. My knowledge of Tibetan is non-existent, and my knowledge of Sanskrit amounts to little more than the ability to consult dictionaries and follow what others have already translated. I suppose I could have looked over Suzuki's shoulder and tried to improve on what he had done. But I saw no advantage in that, certainly no challenge. And so I turned to the Chinese. Feeling a bit like Goldilocks, I concluded Bodhirikai's translation was too full of glosses and digressions. And Shikshananda's, despite being more or less readable, suffered from too many oversimplifications. For all its unusual syntax, Gunabhadra's translation, I decided, was the mama bear of texts. Although making sense of it has been challenging, I am surprised how straightforward it became once I found the two threads that held this sutra together. Basically, the teaching of the Lankavatara is similar to the approach used by later Zen masters who offered their disciples a cup of tea, then asked them to taste the tea. The cup of tea in this case is the Buddha's teaching that traces the universe of our awareness, be it mundane or metaphysical, back to our mind. This is the cup of tea into which this sutra is poured. The Buddha expresses this teaching by describing the world we think of as real as svasita drishya matra, nothing but the perceptions of our own mind. By this, he does not mean that the mind sees or that something is seen by the mind, for any subject or object would be yet another projection of the mind. He simply means that whatever we see or think or feel is our own mind, which is, of course, a tautology. A equals A. But then what Buddhist teaching isn't a tautology? Having put this cup of tea into our hands, the Buddha then asks us to taste the tea, to experience the tautology for ourselves. The phrase he uses to express this is pratiatma gati, personal/inner/ self-realization, or he qualifies the nature of such realization as svapratiatma arya-jnana, the self-realization of Buddha knowledge. The importance of this, which is repeated over and over in these and similar words, was not lost on Suzuki, who noted, the Lankavatara has come to see that the whole of the Buddhist life is not merely in seeing into the truth, but in living it, experiencing it. Studies in the Lankavatara Sutra, pg 105. Of course, the Lanka consists in more than these two phrases. But if you keep these two in view, you won't be distracted by the attractions of the Buddha's tea house. Written in language that would later become part of the Yogacara school of Buddhism, the Lanka provides a view of how the mind works and how the path to enlightenment works, but it uses such devices to get our attention. They are not the teaching. Think of the Lankavatara as Zen tea in a Yogacara cup. Buddhism is concerned with suffering, which is the inevitable result of desire. But the real issue is the self, which is the cause of the desire, which is the cause of the suffering. In the centuries following the Buddha's nirvana, instruction centered around a trio of concepts designed to focus attention in such a way that the non-existence of the self would become evident and the liberation from suffering would follow. These included the 5 skandhas: form, sensation, perception, memory, and consciousness, the 12 ayatanas, 6 powers and 6 domains of sensation, and the 18 dhyatas, the ayatanas with the addition of 6 forms of consciousness. These were 3 views of the same thing, our mind. They were simply different ways of dividing any given moment of awareness into a manageable matrix to demonstrate to anyone willing to wander around these matrices that they contained the universe of our awareness, its inside and its outside, and yet they contained no self. That was their function, to show practitioners that there was no self. While these 3 schemes dealt with the problem of a self, they didn't help explain how we become attached to a self in the first place and how we go from attachment to detachment and thus liberation. Hence, to these were added 3 more schemes, all of which play a much larger role in the Lankavatara than the previous trio. The 3 new schemes are those of the 5 dharmas, the 3 modes of reality, and the 8 forms of consciousness. The 5 dharmas divide our world into name, appearance, projection, correct knowledge, and suchness. The 3 modes of reality do the same with imagined reality, dependent reality, and perfected reality, and the 8 forms of consciousness include the 5 forms of sensory consciousness, conceptual consciousness, the will or self-consciousness, and an 8th form, known as repository consciousness, where the seeds from our previous thoughts, words, and deeds are stored and from which they sprout and grow. As with the earlier trio of concepts, these were designed to account for our awareness without introducing a self. But they had the advantage of also providing a look at how our worlds of self-delusion and self-liberation come about, how enlightenment works, how we go from projection of name and appearance to correct knowledge of suchness, how we go from an imagined reality to a perfected reality, how we transform our 8-fold consciousness into Buddhahood. These schemes were most likely developed separately among different groups of practitioners, but they eventually became the hallmarks of Yogacara Buddhism, with its emphasis on tracing everything back to the mind, back to that cup of tea. The Lankavatara operates within this universe of Yogacara discourse, and it likewise puts that cup of tea into our hands. But then the Lanka sets all of these schemes aside in the interest of urging us to taste the tea for ourselves. The Buddha tells Mahamati to let all conceptions go, let the 5 dharmas go, let the 3 modes of reality go, let the 8 forms of consciousness go, let the Tathagatagarbha go, let everything go. The Buddha's advice in the Lankavatara is for us to drink that cup of tea and not to concern ourselves with where that experience fits into some previously constructed matrix of the mind. Of course, drinking the tea of the mind doesn't take place in space, nor does it occur in a crowd. Hence, the Buddha offers this ancient advice: if bodhisattvas wish to understand the realm of projection in which what grasps and what is grasped are nothing but perceptions of their own minds, they should avoid social intercourse and sleep and cultivate the discipline of mindfulness during the 3 periods of the night. Chapter 2, X, Cup of Tea or Not. No one said it was going to be easy. It wasn't easy when this sutra was written, and it hasn't gotten any easier. The modern world is so full of distractions. Why would anyone want to meditate when they can watch TV, play video games, or surf the web? Just sitting down with a cup of tea can be so hard. The first time I heard about the Lanka was during the 70s when I was living at Haiming Monastery in the hills south of Taipei. The abbot talked about the Lanka as if it was the holy grail of Zen. His name was Wu Ming, and in addition to being the head of the Taiwan Buddhist Association, he was also the head of the island's Linchi, Rinzai, Zen lineage. I took his estimate of the Lanka's significance seriously, and I bought a copy of Gunabhadra's translation on one of my weekly trips into the city. The sutra turned out to be impenetrable. So on a subsequent trip, I bought a copy of Suzuki's English translation. I thought if I read the English and Chinese side by side I would have no problem understanding the text. I was mistaken. Neither language helped. I gave up and moved on to other things, namely, the literary remains of Cold Mountain, Stonehouse, and Bodhidharma and the legacy of China's hermit tradition. In the 35 years since then, I have periodically considered giving the Lanka another try. But I have gotten into the habit of translating Buddhist texts in order to understand them as my practice of the Dharma, and I was not convinced that the Lanka was such a text. Then 10 years ago, on a visit to Sanmin Shuchu, my favorite bookstore in Taipei, I came across a volume, excerpted from the Sutsangching, Volume 1, pp 445 to 681, that compared all 3 Chinese translations of the Lanka paragraph by paragraph. It was just the sort of encouragement I needed. Now that I had all 3 Chinese versions in front of me, I did what comes natural and produced a composite rendering, choosing one line from one translation and another line from another. The result, though, was far from satisfactory. Even though I was putting words on the page, I still didn't understand what they meant. While I was deciding how to proceed, the opportunity to work on the Heart Sutra presented itself. It was such a relief, like running barefoot after wearing army boots. Still, after I finished the Heart Sutra, I resumed work on the Lanka, this time basing my translation on that of Shikshananda, whose Chinese was the easiest to understand. But before I had gotten very far, I was rescued once more, this time by the Platform Sutra. Once again, it was an easy choice. And when the platform was done, I had no trouble finding something else to work on. I was avoiding the Lanka. Then one day in the spring of 2009, while talking about possible projects with Jack Shoemaker, the publisher of this book, my pressing need for a book advance, and his desire to publish a translation of the Lankavatara dovetailed into a book contract with a 2-year deadline. I wonder how many other books have been born from such a conjunction. More than a few, I imagine. And so, several months later, I supplied myself with a set of Chinese commentaries on my next trip to Taiwan. And I began work that summer. Ever since then, I have worked on this translation with few interruptions and have actually gotten to like the Lanka. I have even gotten to like Gunabhadra's translation. Once I became accustomed to his syntax, most of it was not that difficult. But most of it does not mean all of it. Sometimes I felt like I was trying to see through a wall. Hence, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my gratitude to those who made it possible for me to understand what I thought was not possible to understand. I doubt if I would have undertaken this work in the first place if not for D.T. Suzuki's pioneering work on this sutra, not only his translation of the text, but also his studies in the Lankavatara Sutra and his index to the Lankavatara Sutra. These 3 books were of enormous help. I am also indebted to the monks whose commentaries provided me with insights into the meaning as well as the wording of the text, the Ming Dynasty monks Tiangjun, Tseng Fengyi, and Tech and the 20th century monks Taihsu and Yin Shun. Without their help, I would have been lost. In addition to translating the text of the sutra, I have also added summaries, comments, and notes, many of which are indebted to the monks whose commentaries I relied on. I have also noted any phrases or lines for which I have preferred the translations of Bodhiruchi or Shikshananda over that of Gunabhadra. Although I have already stated my reasons for not using the Sanskrit text itself, in the notes I have frequently listed the Romanized Sanskrit for key terms, alas, without the usual diacritics, to give readers an opportunity to explore their wider range of meaning by themselves. Finally, this translation and its commentary have also benefited immeasurably from the generosity of 2 of the world's most respected scholars of Buddhism, Dan Lusthouse and Paul Harrison, both of whom set aside their own work to read through earlier drafts. They have suggested numerous corrections and improvements, and my debt to them is so sufficiently great that I will have to wait for some future lifetime to balance accounts. Before passing the results on to the reader, I should note that I have decided not to include the collection of verses that were appended to the Lankavatara. Sometime between Gunabhadra's translation, 443, in which it is absent, and Bodhirakai's, 513, in which it is present. It was given the title of Sagathakam. Collection of verses, by Nangyo, and includes 884 4-line poems, among which 205 also appear in the main body of the Lanka. Whether one of them borrowed from the other or whether they shared a common source is impossible to say. In any case, the Sagathakam reads as if it was a selection meant to accompany oral instruction. And in the absence of such instruction or an understanding of the context of the poems, I have decided to forego the challenge a translation would have entailed. Still, it does include some worthwhile poems, and fortunately it has already been translated in its entirety as part of Suzuki's translation of this sutra. In regard to my own work on the Lanka, I thought I would never get this far to the point where I would be writing a preface. Admittedly, I'm glad to be passing it on. And naturally, I wish I could have done a better job. But I'm reminded of a comment Nan Huaichin made to me during a 5-hour dinner at his home in Shanghai 5 years ago. The 90-year-old Zen layman recounted when he was young asking Empty Cloud why the old master kept restoring Zen monasteries but never finished them. Empty Cloud slapped his young disciple on the back of the head and said, "Smart Alak. If I finished them, what would the next generation have to do? Indeed, I have left plenty of work for those to come. Meanwhile, I think it's time for that cup of tea." Red Pine, April 1, 2011. Port Townsend, Washington.